got involved in politics against the apartheid state at a very early age. Tell us about that.
It will be useful for me to start at when I was a teenager, and I belonged to the church youth. And it was the young Christian workers, or students then, that introduced me to, during the apartheid years, that introduced me to mixing with other young people. And that kind of, I think, initiated somehow the consciousness of my being. But when I moved into Athlone, I got involved with the Black Women's Federation, and that was 75. And I was raided. That was my first action with security police.
At what age was that?
I was about 20 odd, yeah. And from then it just escalated. The more I got detained, the more determined I was that one day we will be free. And in terms of that, there's no ways that you can stop, because the struggle for us was a way of life. You know, it wasn't a sacrifice. There was no sacrifices that we made. We chose that, and that became the way of life. So we used to eat, drink, sleep, talk politics, and it made me more conscious. And every time that one got detained, it was giving you actually more strength to say, no, when I come out, I have to continue, because one day we have to be free. So that is kind of, in a summary, the way I had started with getting myself actively involved in politics.
How many times were you detained?
Very many, a total of 5 years. That's a total of 5 years. I was in solitary confinement. I was detained in Middelburg. I was detained in Johannesburg, just getting off an aeroplane and detained there. I was detained at Pollsmoor often, very often at Pollsmoor, and also at the Mitchells Plain police station, that public violence, you know, weekend in. And I had 7 charges of public violence. And I believe that I was the only woman in South Africa that had 7 charges of public violence, you know.
At the time?
At the time, yes. Yeah. And I always, you know, when I'm talking about now, I said the only woman, it often reminds me of Elizabeth van der Heyden, who spent 10 years straight in prison. She was in the same trial with Neville Alexander, etc. She spent 10 years straight, 5 years banned and house arrested. And nobody mentions anything about Elizabeth van der Heyden. You know, and I think that's a pity, because the struggles of women just needs to be more emphasis on the struggles of women, because women were detained. And for us, for example, we were in Pollsmoor, we often went on hunger strikes, and we'd go 6 days, 8 days on a hunger strike, when the men at Victor Verster would go for 3 days, and then they're sick because they're macho and they want to still jog and run and lift up weights and do exercises. No, we relaxed. And so nothing was mentioned in the newspapers that the women at Pollsmoor prison were on a hunger strike for so many periods. 3 days in Victor Verster, a big fuss, right? So, and when I talk about struggle, you know, about myself, it's the struggle of many a woman. I'm just being very fortunate to be interviewed by you, but there are so many out there that have been participating in struggle and lost, you know, lost because all sorts of reasons. But the struggle that we went through is a struggle that many, many women have gone through. Those women that work in your kitchens, those women that make soup in townships for children, poor women making soup for other poor children in townships. We don't talk about that, you know. Yeah, and I think that the emphasis, we must try and also popularize the fact that the struggle was actually led by women. If you look at if you look at protests, who are those people that are in the front? It's the women. If you look at the issues at nursery schools or schools where children are being educated and there's a problem at the school, who are the people that go and confront it? It's a woman, you see. And yet it's played down. And although the government says, yeah, we've got a lot of things put in place for women, practically it's difficult for that woman out there in the township to go to a court miles away from where she lives to go and fight for a maintenance issue. And now I'm talking about women in general, but you want the interview to be about more.
No, but it's great that you're telling me that, because it intersects with your life over the years. The key issues, the key point, what is the significance of Elizabeth van der Heijden, and what influence did she have on your life? If at all.
She had a great influence on my life. I often used, and she was one of the people that also assisted me in terms of when I got detained. She would always advise me, this is what you do, you must ask for the prison regulations. The first thing you do is ask for your prison regulations. Otherwise you'll be violating so many of those regulations that keep you there longer. She would tell me the unity in prison is very important. The fact that you try at all costs not to break down in prison, especially when you're with other prisoners, so-called political prisoners. If you break down, it breaks the morale of everyone in that group. You have to be strong, you know. And Elizabeth went through a very difficult stage because she was in Kroonstad, you know, and she was in that heat of that terrible years of the 60s. So you can imagine the issues that they were faced. She and Dulcie September, they were in the same trial. And that is why I think that Elizabeth had a great influence, and the way I respect her for what she taught me that I could share with other people, you know, which was very important, because the slogan says, each one teach one. We used to say each one teach 10, so that we could enable other prisoners. For example, I'll just try and give you a little example. When I was at Paulsmoor prison, the young activists were separated from us. We were 4. And all of a sudden, 2 of them came. The one came from Worcester. And this young lady was crying all the time. She was crying. And the comrades had asked me, please talk to her in the shower, find out what is it, because it's upsetting the morale. So I went to her and I said, comrade, what is the problem? You know, we will support you as far as we can. But we were in quasi-solitary, so that made it even more difficult. We could only get together when we ate. And I said to her, when we're together, then, you know, we can jog. I'll jog with you and talk to you and share things, and you can talk about the challenges that face you. So she said, no, she's very sad because she's not involved in politics. And she was walking down this road in Worcester, and her boyfriend was on the other side of the road, walking towards her, but on the other side of the road. And the police car was coming down, and his name was Amandla. And she called him, she said, Amandla, Amandla, and they stopped her, picked her up, and told her, she shouted Amandla in the street, yet she was calling her boyfriend. And that is what upset her. You see, not the fact that she was calling her boyfriend, but she was in prison because her boyfriend's name was Amandla. Maybe it was his nickname. And she was calling him, and there she ends up in a police van and take her to Paulsmoor. So that obviously had an effect on all of us. However, when she told us the story, it was very difficult for me not to laugh. It was extremely difficult. But when we went to the other comrades and we told the story, and we told it with her, and we laughed about it. We said, just look at the mentality, you see. It's not even safe to have a name like
mentality
of the police. You know, look at that, because now you can't even call your boyfriend Amandla, because you call him Amandla, you go to jail. So that's just one of the little stories that we have.
Do you remember her name?
I don't remember her name. You know, it was comrades all the time, yeah.
For people that don't know, can you give us a snapshot that for those who's going to watch this program, how would you characterize solitary confinement? What happens to a person? What is it and what happens to a person when you're in solitary confinement for political reasons?
If you come out of solitary confinement and you are not scarred, you can't avoid that. You see, maybe I should just share my experiences of being in solitary confinement. When I went into solitary, I was at Sea Point police station. Now, you know, we lived in Mitchell's Plain near the sea. You get the smell of the sea. You get that smell and you become nostalgic, right? And I was in a single cell, obviously, with a courtyard and a shower outside. And at the top was a grill. And when I went into solitary, the birds used to sit on the grill. But by the time I left solitary, which was about 2.5 months after that, when I came out of solitary, the birds were in my cell. I used to call it a room in there, because I used to take the bread that they used to give us and put it along the ground so that the birds I used to talk to the birds, and that's why I love birds, by the way, and they used to come into my cell. Now, you know, when the security police comes to you, they don't come at a very decent hour. They come when you're completely at your weakest. That's in the early hours of the morning. You're sleeping at your best. And they would come. And I remember the one day, or one early hours of the morning, when they came, there was about 10 of them. And it was the first time, Daniel, that I asked a policeman in uniform, "Don't leave me." I was scared. And the policeman just disappeared. And they started questioning me, because I belonged to a cell that was printing a paper called The Voice for the Council of Churches. And the paper was banned, but we continued to print this. And they started questioning me. And you are first at a hell of a disadvantage, because you know we had afros, right? Now when you're lying on the one side, then your afros must plait the side, man. Now you get up, it's all like afro here and flat here. You are already disadvantaged by the way you are presenting yourself to these 10 drunk men. And they wanted to know.
Drunk men, were they?
Security police.
Security police.
Yes. And they wanted to know who printed, give me the names of the people in the cell. And all I was saying was, my name is Theresa Solomon. I live at 144 Orpheus Crescent, Mitchell's Plain, Woodlands. And they went on and on. And I don't know where I got this courage. And I said to them, "Why are you so angry?" So the one answered and said, "I've just got off the aeroplane. I was in Joburg. We were watching some rugby match and VP lost. So they brought that anger. I think they visited all the detainees when they got to the aeroplane, probably said, now we're going to fix these people because we lost. They're from the Western Province." The other thing is that you start talking to yourself, and you lose. It's like when you're on a hunger strike, you actually lose consciousness at some stage. So when I was eventually left out of solitary, I went straight into Victor Verster, and I was like an animal, because I was climbing on the bed and climbing, you know, they have a little cupboard, climbing on the cupboard, talking all the time. And one of the comrades said to me, after about 24 hours of just talking, a whole lot of nonsense in any case, I thought, in hindsight, she'd said, "Okay, enough now. That helped. And to be in solitary, it's really solitary. You know, you have no communication with anybody except the security police. And that's not communication, that's interrogation, which is very different. And when they bring your food, the ordinary SAP, they'll throw it in, just throw it, lock the door again. So you are with yourself all the time. And that's the time when you need to be focused on how you're going to survive this. So you jog, you pray, you jog, and you pray, and that's how you, and you also psych yourself up, because what Elizabeth also shared with me was what they could do when they take you out of solitary. They'll take you out, and a couple of hours later they'll put you back into solitary. That breaks you. And this particular day, this SAP person came in. Actually, she was a security woman, and she came to me and she said, "You are being placed." So I thought, okay, I'm going to Paulsmoor. And when I went out of I packed my things, went out of the cell, I sat in the charge office. But when I looked at the time, it was 3 o'clock, and I knew that Paulsmoor won't take me after 3:30. So this is one of the tricks that they're using. But as I sat there, I could see the yachts from the police station, and people were coming in, so could see people, and I could see the yachts, and I thought, shoot, it's so nice to be out. 3:30, she came and she took me back to the cell, and that was devastating for me because I cried. I was upset. I thought I was going to go now to my comrades at Paulsmoor. So I got back into the cell, and I thought, the security police are going to come and question me sometime during this night. So I have to be fit. And then I took a shower, and I read the Bible, and I went to sleep. And lo and behold, that was the morning actually that they came, these 10 of them that were nicely under the influence of alcohol. Solitary confinement, I do not wish on anybody. Not anybody, not my worst enemy would I want to wish solitary confinement on. Because, the side effects, sometimes it still stays with you, because not all of us went for trauma counseling afterwards, right? So these little things, in my one detention in Middelburg, I was also in solitary. And it was very difficult for the police there to understand me. They used to call me Miss Busak, because it was the first time that they had a colored woman in this prison, in this police station. And it was the worst detention, the shortest detention, but the worst detention, because during the night, before that I said my rights, my prison or police regulation says I must have 6 blankets, it's winter. And they brought me the 6 blankets. And I had a bush jacket on, and I went under the blankets and I fell asleep. But they don't close the grill. They close the grill, they don't close the door. So it's cold in the Karoo, very freezing cold. And I went under these blankets, and during the middle of the night I started itching, Any rate, and I got up the next morning, I folded the blankets and I put it down. And lo and behold, those blankets were doing this. It was riddled with white lice. Up until today, I cannot sleep under a blanket. Up until today, that's years ago. I still cannot sleep under a blanket. If I go and visit one of my best friends, she always says, "Please don't put a blanket on Theresa's bed." It's what's still left with me, right? When we were at Paulsmoor, we see how the ward, we smell the braais that the warders would have, and when you kind of have a dislike for braais, although you like braais before you went in, but you have this dislike for braais all of a sudden. So when you come out, you just, no, I don't want to braai. No, I don't want to braai, because it reminded us of when you were in prison.
It symbolizes the security police.
Exactly, yes.
So, what pushed you, given the detaining of you in the solitary confinement was as a result of you being involved in politics in particular. What pushed you to be part of a women's march during the early years?
The fact that I always used to tell my child as well, I always used to tell her, you know, when we used to go driving to the beach and we can't swim there and we can't swim there, then I would say to her, you can't swim there, it's for the rich. I never said for the white people. I said, that's for the rich, we can't afford to swim there. When I used to speak to her, I used to tell her that my involvement is not only for her. My involvement is for the children of her age, for the future. Because one day we are going to be free. And that was my personal motivation, to enable me to continue being involved in the struggle for liberation. Not for one particular child, that was mine, but for the children of South Africa. Because what did they have then during an apartheid system? You know, and so that was always my motivation, that I will one day, I know that we are going to be free.
So what's the importance of because clearly during that period, black people in general and Africans in particular, as it's been quoted in the ANC's Freedom Charter, were oppressed, heavily oppressed. There was no gender separation, men and women. But at a certain period, you chose to be part of a women's march and by implications a women's struggle. Why that separation, if I can call it that, but also why did you consider the importance, the preeminence, emphasizing a woman's struggle?
Yeah, you know that for me the emphasis was not not that you're mentioning this, but the emphasis for me was not against men. My understanding was always, together with my partner or with the men, we will together fight for freedom, right? But in certain issues, for example, at times most of the men were working and some of the women were at home. So there was much easier for us to mobilize and to also empower women, because generally, and it's still today, I mean, it might be a bit better, but it's still today, women are very much still oppressed. And so for us to, I think it's the consciousness, you know, of the fact that your struggle is not about the male, it's about an evil system. And with this system brings all these evil things, oppression of women, oppression of men, exploitation, etc. All of that. If you combine that, then you realize that the struggle is not against this man, but it's against a system. But at certain times, you have to protest as women, to empower women. And so that was probably the motivation that we used. Or that we spoke to other women, especially in the Black Women's Federation, UCO. There were other women that had the same thoughts, that when you got together, you could actually mobilize. It was shown in, the Women's March, for example. You know, it was women that took up that march August the 9th. Only women. And it had nothing to do with men, in terms of that men are oppressing us, that men are, you know, not good partners, etc. They were there because as women they were subjected to a bad system within the apartheid scene.
There seems to be a phenomenon in which men, I think, doesn't always seem to understand or comprehend. Is is the women's struggle much more complex and intense than a general struggle for freedom in any society?
I think in particular, some issues. I think some issues. There are many laws which kind of protect women. But it is difficult for women to access it. You know, extremely difficult for women to access it. And I think that if it was in a male situation, they would be able to access much more easier than what women can. If we just look at, for example, battering of women, the lack of safe houses for our women that are being battered daily. How many women are murdered during a month, right? How many girl child are being raped and beaten? And it's not the fight against the males. It's the fight for the rights of women to be acknowledged and also to be able to access these beautiful laws that we have which protect women. Someone asked me the other day, if you had to be reincarnated, how would you like to come back? I said, as a rhino. They said, why is a rhino? I said, yeah, you're talking about the horns that being shaved, which is sad, but they are more protected than women. There's rhino protests, there's people that are picketing against rhino, there's this, that. How many protests do we have for women's rights? You know, how many women can stand on the corners and say, I'm a battered woman? Or many women standing together and say, I'm a battered woman, please, you know. How many children and women have to be raped first before they can go to the court and stand there and say, don't release him, no bail for him. In the meantime, what has been the protection for those people that have been injured and battered, you see? So I'm not sure if I answered you.
Tell us, when you then were part of the civic kayak,
Yes.
Service Association, Housing...
Cape Areas Housing Action Committee.
Cape Areas Housing Action Committee. And it played quite a significant role in dealing with community struggles and housing issues. What was your role in there, you particularly?
I was the secretary of the Cape Areas Housing Action Committee. But I was also chairperson.
Wilfred Rhodes then?
Yes, Wilfred was the chairperson, I was the secretary. After Trevor, remember, yeah. And then I was chairperson.
Trevor Manuel.
Yes. Okay. I was chairperson of the Woodlands Residents Association, which was banned. Then I became chairperson of the Woodlands Action Committee, which was banned. Then I became chairperson of the Woodlands Civic Association, which managed to carry on the works in the community. Now, our involvement was what those extremely politically conscious people would say, sop and gombeers politics. But it was those politics that actually did a lot of the change. The internal struggles of what had happened in South Africa didn't much depend on the out struggles of sabotage, sanctions, which was important, but it was the struggles inside the country, and it was the civic organizations. It was the civic organizations that was one of the major committees within the UDF. The Civic Association, for example, the Woodlands Action Committee, the area that I lived in, on New Year's Eve in, I think it was the year 1980 something, New Year's Eve. Now imagine Cape Town, imagine New Year's Eve, what we are doing, right? We took a march to the rent office because that year there was an increase of rent thrice and people were just not able to cope. we took a march which was predominantly women that went down. There were about 500 of us that stood in front of that rent office. It was the divisional council, and we had asked them to stop the rent increases. Do you know what happened then? The divisional council had stopped increases of rent throughout the Western Province for the divisional council areas. That small group of 500 women did that.
Which year was that?
It was the middle 80s, right? And when we got to the rent office, the security police were there. I was in disguise, by the way. And they shouted, the security police shouted, "Where's Mrs. Solomon?" It was an amazing thing. Every woman was saying, "I'm Mrs. Solomon, I'm Mrs. Solomon, I'm Mrs. Solomon." You know, that unity that civics had brought together, because the issues that women had to take up was washing lines. You would fight over a washing line. You would fight over the fact that there was not enough space for our children to be playing in safe areas. You would fight for proper pavements. You would fight for schools in our areas. You would fight for children to be transported from one school to another school because it was not safe for them to be walking. All those issues. We would fight for a traffic light. We would fight for a robot, a traffic light and a stop street and a pedestrian crossing. We fought for a hospital. You know, we had a major fight for a hospital. And eventually, what did they do? They built a psychiatric hospital, and our response was, yes. You think we're all mad, that's why we need a psychiatric hospital. When the Lentecare Hospital, and now, about 3 years ago, they built the General Hospital. After we moved into Mitchell's Plain in 76. It took from 76 up until 3 years ago to build a hospital, which is the basic need of any community, right? And that hospital, it's again not talking to the communities, not talking to the civics. You can't build a hospital for 200 beds when you must look at a population of 1.5 million people in Mitchell's Plain plus Philippi. Now, this issue of what hasn't changed is we are not communicating with our communities. Our civic associations are very few, because the times have changed. People are struggling to put bread on the table. That for them is more important at this point in time than to worry about a wash line and a pavement and a traffic light. The drugs in our communities, it's bizarre. It's killing our communities. And it's not only in the Western Province, it's a national problem. And who would be the organization that would take up those issues? The police can't deal with it. It's the community, civic organizations. And that is why I'm so strongly focused on the fact that we need to start our civic association. It must grow again, become strong, to take up the issues that are affecting communities, that are actually destroying our communities, destroying our children, you know. And to have belonged to kayak was another wonderful experience, because you had civic associations from all over, you know, the province that would come and share experiences and also share challenges that faced them, which was sometimes no different to the challenges of the areas that you lived in, you know. So civic associations is one of those basic structures that moved the struggle. It was the civic associations that used to take to the streets and fight with the police, you know.
What is the significance of, because what you're explaining is community mobilization, community action. Why is that so important why was it so important in fighting the apartheid regime, the apartheid state?
Because during that system, there were many things that were lacking, that was provided for privileged people, the white people, which was not provided for anyone else. If you look at District 6, for example, District 6 there was a forced removal of District 6. Very little is mentioned about the forced removal of District 6. People moved to Atlantis, 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers out of their workplace. Mitchell's Plain, another 40, 50 kilometers. All the areas that were allocated for housing were far from the city. And when they went into the city, into these suburbs, put a nice word to it, not a township, a suburb, people didn't know one another. There was the need to claim corners, that's when the gang started, coming together, the young people, nothing to do, no community facilities. If you looked at District 6, you had halls almost on every corner. You had this beautiful Bloemhof flats that had space for tennis, table tennis, halls, beautiful, always place for people to gather. You never had that in townships. You didn't have schools. You had to fight for schools. You didn't have community centers. You didn't have play parks. You had a divided community. Everybody scared of one another because you don't know who you are and where you come from. And it was then the time when people needed to get together to ensure that the basic needs of people, health, schooling, health, education, etc., safe playgrounds for children, that these amenities had to be provided. But who would take it up? It was only the civic organization, because we were the people that lived in those areas. Yeah.
So you were then involved in the Cape Action Housing Committee, and then you were involved in different civic structures at community level within the big, huge Mitchell's Plain area, which was in the woodlands. You had a rich experience of political activity among community groups and women's issues. In post-apartheid South Africa, you then were propelled into, if I can use that phrase, into the new leadership of the city of Cape Town, first being a deputy mayor, and then eventually became the mayor of Cape Town. Different roles, different responsibilities. Can you explain that and how you manage that shift?
There was a march onto Civic Center when I was mayor. There was a march onto the Civic Center to something about the electricity, if I remember correctly.
Which year was that?
In 96. It was 96.
2 years after the democracy.
Yeah. I was deputy mayor, and then 96 I was mayor. Right? And I led that march. So I led the march onto myself, by the way. I must have, because I was wearing the chain, the robe, and I led the march onto the council, because I forgot, that I'm actually sitting in there, and I had to march here, and I but I preferred to be here, so I marched here, led the march there, and in council, it was one of the political parties that got up and said, "How dare you, mayor, lead a march onto yourself?" So I said, it was easy, I just walked. So it was difficult, right? But what was the advantage for me? The advantage was that I could then go into townships, march with people that were against the drug abuse in the communities, right? Against gangsterism. I would lead those marches. And it was also a way to kind of show young people that there can be a place for you somewhere if you're committed to what you feel is the correct thing, you know. And it was sad for me to move out of Woodlands, because, you know, all the years I stayed in Mitchell's Plain, when I was deputy mayor, when I was mayor, when I was in the provincial, I was in provincial as well, spokesperson for crime for the ANC. I was living in Mitchell's Plain, which was a great advantage to our communities, especially to the young. Because what had eventually happened was people had moved out. I mean, I had to move to Tanzania, then I had to leave Mitchell's Plain. So all your role models were taken out of the community, and then there was no role models that young people could actually look up to.
Remember, you were an activist.
Yes.
And you were leading particular structures, organizations, and then you became the mayor. Now it's quite enlightening to hear that you have somebody who's the mayor of a city leading a march against her own city. How did you get to that decision? Other than the fact that you walked, because of the march you walk.
Yes. I think it was still this ingrained, you know, mentality that at heart you're still a political activist. Like, I'm sitting and talking to you, but as I'm sitting here, I'm still a political activist, you know. And if there are issues that need to be taken up, I'll take it up. And even when I was, you know, it's actually for me difficult to explain. Within myself, I'm a political activist. Then I become a mayor with this heavy chain that was made for men. It wasn't made for women. It used to hook into your shoulders. And you had this cloak, and then you had to adapt now, right? But here at the back of your mind, you're still that activist. So in chambers, for example, or in subcommittees, in those subcommittees, you acted as an activist. You see, because you're a councillor, you're also the mayor, but you're also a councillor. So you sit in those committees. You can sit on housing, electricity, whatever, facilities, amenities, health. And at that level, you could then, your activism would come out in terms of your contribution that you make in those committees. So it wasn't a difficult thing for me to march against the city, because I was used to marching. It was...
Were you agreeing with the marches that the cause was right at the time?
I wouldn't march if I wasn't agreeing with them. No, I marched because I was agreeing with what the issue was. And I think it was about electricity. And you remember, we led a campaign in Mitchell's Plain, the EPC, electric petition, that we had millions of signatures for that. And so it was also about the due date on our electricity account. So we had this big, massive campaign. And so that was still year within, you know, and that was the campaign that we were actively involved in. So when these people marched against the due date, I joined the march because I was also affected by the way I lived in Mitchell's Plain.
So you took the past struggles, you transferred into the present, meaning the time that you were mayor of Cape Town. But you had the power to intervene and fix things as the mayor.
We must remember, what you must remember, the time that we were as mayors and deputy mayors was ceremonial. It was not executive mayors. Now, a ceremonial mayor has very little power as opposed to executive mayors. The executive mayors have more power. When Norma India took over, she was an executive mayor, because I was old.
So who was your partner at the time?
My deputy.
When you were mayor, yeah. Deputy mayor, you were with?
Arthur Jacobs, yeah, from Khayelitsha, right? And then...
So you had ceremonial powers?
And you know what the ceremonial powers?
Explain that to us.
I'll give you a glamorous one. Oh, they're all glamorous. The one where...
Are you the ribbon cutter?
You can cut ribbons, you can kiss babies, but that wasn't, I would always kiss a baby. You see, I might not always cut a ribbon on my child's hair, the ribbon that she wears, yeah. But we had the 75th anniversary of the Navy. And the Navy had come from many places in the world. And we had to take the salute. So that was ceremonial. As the Navy marched past the parade in the City Hall, I had to take the salute. Now that was ceremonial. There was nothing I was not in any discussions or debates or negotiations with the Navy. That wasn't my task. All I was there was to take the salute. Now that was, and then entertain them, okay, at the Civic Center. So that's ceremonial. If you, for example, an opening of a hospital, you would go, you don't have any dealings in terms of the negotiations by the hospital, but you go there and you cut the ribbon, you open the hospital, opened by the mayor, like that. And then you have the little ones. We at school, and at end of your concert would want you to come and cap the children, and you do that. And I liked that, because at every ceremonial activity, there were always young people and children that, looked up to you, because this fact of the need for role models, that is our weakness at this point in time. The need for role models is very difficult to find in townships, unfortunately, for all sorts of reasons. Right? So it was important for me always to make myself accessible to the townships and to activities where children were involved, with teenagers. The matric balls, go there, motivate the children, and that type of thing.
Okay, so political activist, community leader. Then you get moved into, by your political party, into the ceremonial mayor role of the city of Cape Town. The first woman, but also the first colored person in a mayoral position.
The first colored woman. First democratically elected woman, because Patricia was before me. Yeah, she was the old system.
Yes, and then you got moved to Tanzania.
No, I went to provincial legislature. For spokesperson for crime against the ANC, for the ANC, for 1 year.
Community leader, activist, and then you move from there into the leadership of the city. Right? In a mayoral position. You're the first black and colored woman post-apartheid to be in the city as the mayor. From there you move to the provincial legislature for the Western Cape, and then from there you get appointed as the ambassador for Tanzania.
There's no difference between an ambassador and a high commissioner. The high commissioner is in the Commonwealth countries, or high commissioners. Outside the Commonwealth are ambassadors, but you have the same jobs.
And then from Tanzania you moved to Canada, also High Commissioner. High Commissioner stroke ambassador, just for other people to understand. Now clearly all of that required different maneuverability, navigating your roles and responsibilities. How did you go about that? Because it's different responsibilities.
You know what my university was? Mitchell's Plain.
Okay, tell us about that.
That was the experience that I got. The campaigning, how to conduct yourself, how to be disciplined, how to approach people, how to talk to elders, people than you in the campaign and so forth. That was my university. And that I took with me throughout all my positions that I held. And when I went to Tanzania, it was extremely easy for me because Tanzania loved South Africans, and they loved the High Commission, you know, the office of the High Commissioner. They were very friendly. When Tanzanians are very warm, friendly, and genuine people. And in Tanzania, I learned a lot about the ANC, more than what I learned back home. And one of the things, or two of the things that I learned was the camps that the ANC had in Tanzania, Morogoro, Takawa, Kongwa, and many others, but that the Tanzanians had given land, almost you could say a village, to the ANC that were in exile to develop. Right? So on this one, or both these farms, Takawa and Morogoro, in Morogoro they had a piggery, they had a fully equipped place where they milked the cows, they had chickens for Africa, they had cassava, this is the kind of potato that the Tanzanians eat, and they had they had a vegetable garden. They had houses, they had a creche, they had a high school, they even had a little university. And what South Africans don't know is that Tanzanians used to give blood to the liberation movement, those that were really fighting, you know, like Swapo was also there, ZANU was also there. They used to donate blood for the freedom fighters. That every child in Tanzania used to give a shilling or a penny towards a little kitty to buy food for those people that were in exile in Tanzania. And that is why it is so sad when we have xenophobia in our country. And it's the lack of our government that hasn't shared the experiences of people in exile, where they were, and what those countries did for them to enable them to come back and govern in South Africa. And therefore people, when there's an attack on xenophobia, you can't blame, you know, no blame must be made on these people that are attacking, because they don't realize what these countries have actually done to ensure that we get our freedom, particularly in Tanzania, Algeria. You know, people were over-sympathetic towards the struggle in South Africa. And so it's sad, it's very sad that we have not been able to share those experiences with communities, to make them understand, you know, that for someone from Tanzania to sell an orange on the street is not taking their jobs, you know. And the fact that those countries welcomed us and gave us land, fed us, you know, gave blood to those people that were fighting a war. And so when I was in that country, it was more for me also to appreciate my own country, because I was in a country that had a standard of a very difficult mission in terms of, for example, we didn't have supermarkets there. We didn't have, you know, the power would just go down for about 2 weeks, and then you don't have electricity. But the residents always had, because we had a generator. The water, they call it Maji Safi, clean water. It's not clean water, it comes in with a truck, like you put petrol in the ground. That's how your water gets put in, and it's not clean water. And so you appreciate the things that South Africa has. For example, when you go into your home, you switch on the light. Okay, not now always, but you could switch on your light goes on. You could open your tap, your water comes, you could drink that water. It was a humbling experience for me to be in Africa, to be South Africa is also Africa, but to be in deep Africa, where people are experiencing very difficult lives, but are contented, you know. And so firstly, it was an amazing experience because I met with ambassadors and high commissioners from all over the world, which was very, very friendly towards South Africa, because I think we had a very high standard. You know, there's been involved in the struggle for liberation, being free, and now you come in as ambassadors to, or high commissioners to other countries. So you mix with other ambassadors and high commissioners. And in Africa, it was very rewarding, because you could do a lot of things for those communities. Like you could, we have a South African week. We actually started the South African Business Forum. So when South Africans came in, we would have a week of just, you know, exposing South Africa. And whatever donations we got, we'd put a solar system in some remote school or a remote hospital somewhere out there. There was one time that we had sent a doctor from a very remote area in Tanzania that had just received an incubator, and he didn't know how to use it, and we brought him to South Africa, sent him to Grooteskloof, and he trained there, and they actually kept him and brought his wife so that they could learn other equipment in terms of healthcare. So those were the things that we could do, as opposed to what we couldn't do in Canada, because it's affluent, you know, and there's still lots of things in Tanzania that people need. I was looking at a wheelchair the other day, and I told my grandchild, that is the wheelchair that they use in Tanzania, this handle, you know. They still use that as wheelchair, I mean, like antiquated, but we could manage to get wheelchairs for the hospitals. So it was, for me, very rewarding.
So how did you navigate the difference between a High Commissioner post and a High Commissioner for Canada? Were there any differences in it?
In terms of?
Your role. How did you act in those different continents, clearly different circumstances, one affluent, the other relatively poor?
Yeah, I was actually a bit shocked when I went to Canada. Let me first talk about the weather. I lived in the second coldest capital city of the world. The first one being Moscow, the second one being Ottawa, which goes minus 40, right? So that was another experience for me. And then Canada has First Nations, the so-called Red Indians, of which I became very close to because of the struggles that the First Nations, you know, are exposed to. If you go into a First Nations reserve, you think you're in Manenberg. Also very beautiful people. Also had to struggle. There was a lot of struggles in terms of the First Nations and the Canadians. And you know, Canada was first called Kanata, which was the name that the First Nations gave. I mean, the colonialists came into Canada, they started changing the name and said Canada, right? And First Nations people are very humble, yet they were a warring nation, you know. Like the Maoris, I think, were also a warring nation. It gets taken away from you. So I was exposed to the fact that oppression is not only unique to South Africa. You know, it's happening all over the world, where there are First Nations and the way people are treating the First Nations. It was also, because it was an affluent country, it was very difficult to actually get into any of the projects, because every project was well, cared for. They had finances and so forth. But the one thing one of the things that I also learned in Canada was the interest in their youth. Like during the summer holidays, when people take their holiday, the youth would take over and work in libraries, and work in shops, and work in Parliament, and they would become the curators of museums. So it educates them, and they become empowered, and they can explain every picture on the wall and every statue and so forth. And they like matric, our equivalent education. So, which I thought was something that we could also introduce into South Africa, with the fact that our youth have very little exposure to many things. If you just look at Cape Town, for example, you have so many museums there. You have this beautiful gardens, you have the botanical gardens, and you have the gardens there where the Parliament is. You can take youth and teach them horticulture, for example, get them interested, in the land and what grows and so forth, squirrels and whatever. And in that way, we have swimming pools where our youth could go and become lifeguards, at swimming pools. And I think there's a lot of things that we could do with our young people, instead of let ourselves allow these young people that are supposed to be the future, but we provide nothing for them now to make them very good citizens in the future that would enable them to become responsible citizens. And I thought that was something that I really took out of Canada, just in my mind, that how they also become the Governor General's guards. In London you have those guards with that black things that they wear, and they stand. And these young people standing at the gates, and it's very hot, in Canada, it can be very hot. Then they stand at the gates for hours, and they do this march and, discipline. So there's so many things that we could, I think, do and learn from other countries as well. Not learn how to exploit First Nations. I mean, that don't want to learn that, because we're used to that business here in South Africa. Yeah.
When you were in Tanzania, you had the opportunity to interact with the different camps of the ANC. And Magorogoro seems to be quite an important history in the South African struggle.
Solomon Mshlangu.
Yes. But also remember the Chris Hani matter.
Yes.
And in that particular era, what have you learned about the African National Congress in exile in Tanzania, and how does that inform? Because as an ambassador, you had access to a number of people, structures that links to the country you come from. What have you learned during that time about the ANC in exile, and lessons for the present?
The first response that I have to make is that when I was in Tanzania, there were no ANC people there, right? They were all back in South Africa. I think what the one aspect in terms of both Morogoro and Dakawa was the fact that the ANC had left those camps intact. They had houses, and there were street names, and there was creches, and there was schools, and there was a little university as well. So the ANC had left that intact, because they also received assistance from countries outside of Africa that gave them the lorry and gave them the materials to build, and also assisted in terms of helping people to build the houses, the hospitals, the schools, and so forth. So all that was intact, and was still intact when I got there. And then in Dakawa, it was exactly the same thing. Except that in Dakawa, it was, if you misbehaved in Morogoro, they would send you to Dakawa. Okay, so Dakawa was like a maybe a safe, not a safe house, a place to become to be taught to be disciplined within the Mkhonto Wesizwe structure.
School of discipline, a village of discipline.
Yes.
Camp of discipline.
Camp of discipline, yes. But it was also a camp that was, you know, well established because of the ANC. It was well established. So when they left, right, especially in Morogoro, because they had all this infrastructure, even the animals and so forth, when they left, when the ANC left, they left a lot of children behind as well. Besides the children that were left behind, and I understand that, it's called, you know, the conditions of war, or, you know, the spillover, right? So when they left, they had all the pigs and the cows and the chickens. So the Morogoro people would just come and help themselves, which was okay, because they needed to eat meat, so they would take them. And the ANC had no problem because they left it there. And that is what the overseer would say. No, they were very pleased that the ANC could actually, you know, leave that for the people to eat and use the land and so forth. But when I went to Dakawa, I noticed that it was a bit run down. And then I spoke to the Minister of Agriculture, Minister Luwasa. I spoke to him and I told him that there was also a school at Dakawa, and there was also a little village and a nursery school, so people could they were living there, but they needed equipment. And I said they needed the tractors to, you know, turn the soil and help them to grow and so forth. And about 2 months later, he phoned me and told me, when am I going through to Dakawa? Because there's a surprise for me. I said I was going through sometime. And eventually when I went through, I saw 10 brand new tractors, red, I'll never forget it. They were lined up like that, and they were going to be teaching the people that lived there how to till the soil, how to grow and so forth. So, and that was always something that you could work together with the government, you know, with the Tanzanian government, because then President Mkapa was extremely close to President Mbeki. And, you know, we were going through the peace process of Burundi during those years. And the president now used to be the chief negotiator. And he was often in Tanzania. He was there sometimes for almost every month for 2 weeks, negotiating with the rebels, the then rebels who are now in government, in power. So there was this affection between the government and the South African embassy. So it was a fairly easy mission. It was also, I think I mentioned, a hardship mission. We could come home every 6 weeks, but which I never did, because you have to like get into the flow, you know. And Tanzania is a country very much like Cape Town in terms of laid back. So it suited me well, because it was as laid back as I was at that time. Yeah.
If you get the opportunity to, through this recording, to reflect on your experience, what would you, from the lessons that you've learned, tell the South African youth in political parties across the spectrum, in people don't enjoy Ratepayers Association, Civic Association? What are the key cardinal things that they need to know when they stepped into these positions to serve people? What are the key lessons that you will convey to them?
My first comment or response will be, especially to maybe students or learners at high school, You are aware that many of our children can't read. You know, it's a reading week this week, by the way. There's something wrong that our children have difficulty in reading. I'm not sure if it's also the fact that we don't have enough access to libraries like in the townships, or their mobile libraries where children can have access to books. Books are very expensive. And it's very difficult for people to buy a book for a child. And if you've got 4 children, it's extremely difficult. You can say, oh, share the book. But they're different ages. So the fact that our country needs our population to start reading. And that's one way in which our youngsters can assist, our young adults. Offering their time, like during the school holidays, for example, 2 days in the week for a high school student to negotiate with the principal, bring me some of your learners that are having challenges with reading, and we will assist in terms of getting them to make reading become fun. Let them have access to read and to gain knowledge. Our other challenge that we have is that our learners are having difficulty with maths. Now, I'm actually looking at what high school students can do, right? What they can assist with, even after school. In your community, there must be 1 or 2 or 3 children that you can assist with helping with maths or reading or whatever. That's part of how you start becoming involved, right? The other thing is to start youth clubs that are progressive, that would take up issues that are affecting youth. There are so many challenges for our young people, far too many for them to handle, And it becomes difficult for them to grow up in an environment where it is difficult, pressures outside, pressures inside. And so it would be great if they could, start with little things. Teaching children to read, assisting with the math, assisting with the science.
How should we overcome the divisions that we currently experience in South Africa? Huge divisions: race, gender, class, haves and have-nots, factions. Earlier on I said I don't want to blame anybody, and I really don't want to blame anybody, but I must blame somebody. It's one of our weaknesses, like I spoke earlier about the fact that we didn't inform people about what countries outside of South Africa has done to conscientize them, so that they don't have the xenophobia approach to things. We never dealt with racism. We've never, ever dealt with racism. That's another challenge, right? We should have started with that very early, and that was a weakness. But is racism, as opposed to gender issues, is racism as important as what is happening to women in townships? We're making a big fuss now about the racism that's going on. What is happening to those women that are being battered and children that are being raped? Are we making enough noise about that? You see? And I'm not saying that racism is not an issue. You see it and you feel it often, right? It's so ingrained, right? And I think that it will probably assist in how we conduct ourselves with our own children. How we conduct ourselves. Earlier on I said, we never said that this is a white beach, We never said when these white men used to come and detain us, Afrikaners. We never said that's a white man that's coming to detain us. And my child used to grapple with this because that is what she saw, you see. So what role are we playing in terms of how are we influencing our children or their friends in terms of this class division,
the racism and so forth. Do we say, no, you don't play with that one because they're not wearing Nike shoes? You see? No, you don't play with that one because their nose isn't sharp enough. I don't think you should play with that one, but hulle het nie hare nie. You know that story, eh? How we are and how we judge people according to our hair, according to the color of the skin, according to our nose, according to what we wear. But are we talking about the person, the individuals? What are we telling our children? How do we expose them? And that is part of what the young people must be doing. And they can only do it if they are influenced or getting knowledge from conscious people. You see? We mustn't hide our consciousness. We must expose it to enable other youngsters to understand. You see, that this is how it should be and this is how it must be. And racism is personified. It's terrible. And it seems to be getting worse, you know. But again, I'm saying, within the context of the racism, so is the gender issue.